Welcome, I'm joined by Stephen Rapp, the former United States Ambassador at large for war crimes issues. We will be focusing on the subject of war crimes with regards to the 2020 Karabakh War. Ambassador, thank you very much for your time.
Very good to be with you today.
So I know you've been observing what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh, and there have been accusations of war crimes on both sides. Armenia has accused Azerbaijan of using cluster munitions and white phosphorus, and Azerbaijan too has accused Armenia of using cluster munitions on civilian populations. How did you see the situation in Karabakh with regards to war crimes?
Well, based on what I've seen, and of course these are reports that would need to be verified, and there would have to be a judicial process to determine really the truth beyond a reasonable doubt. But if the allegations are true, we have violations of the laws of war which would apply here, including indiscriminate attacks on civilians, which is a war crime. The use of certain munitions which are used in a way that doesn't distinguish between military and civilian targets, that would be a war crime. Certainly, we saw evidence, video evidence of the killing of individuals that have been taken custody, and once a person has surrendered or custody's been taken, it makes no difference whether they were a fighter beforehand. They're now outside of combat, and summary execution is murder as a war crime, and so those are all violations. The challenge here, I think, is a question of enforcement. We don't, neither Azerbaijan or Armenia are members of the International Criminal Court. So there's no court that has jurisdiction to prosecute these cases at the moment, other than the national systems of those countries. And whether that happens it will be challenging given the conflict. But obviously, and certainly our American position and really the international position is the obligation always first is on the state, and on the commanders, on the forces, on their leaders for establishing accountability for these violations and doing it themselves. And the international community doesn't get involved, even where there's a treaty, and even where countries are in a court, unless there's a failure to do that in a genuine way at the national level. There are also, there's a newer convention on munitions. There's landmines, as we recall, but after the landmine convention, which wasn't ratified by a number of major states, including the United States, and certainly not Russia and China, then there was a cluster munitions convention as well. Again, one that's been ratified by more than 100 countries, generally smaller countries, predominantly Western democracies, and not the countries in the region. And so it's a situation where there really isn't a place to go to for criminal accountability. Now, there are ways in which this issue can be investigated, particularly through in Geneva, where the Human Rights Council looks at these violations, not from the point of view of the laws of war, but they are also violations of international human rights law, denying people their right to life or physical integrity. And human rights law continues to apply even during a conflict, though it can be affected by the laws that allow combatants to engage and fight each other and kill each other. And then it's not a crime. But there are a variety of situations where, such as indiscriminate attacks and killing of people that have surrendered, that are human rights violations. So the Human Rights Council in Geneva could vote for an inquiry or investigation of one side or another, and has done that in a number of situations, even against the interests of great powers. Palestine against the interests of the U.S., or Syria against the interests of Russia, or Sri Lanka against the interests of China. So it's possible sometimes for that Human Rights Council to take positions and get inquiries going, but then how to enforce what they find, it becomes a challenge.
Well, you mentioned the International Criminal Court. I'm interested what the procedure is if a state has grievances with regards to war crimes, and what would your recommendations be to the Armenian government right now, which is claiming it has multiple grievances?
Well, it could consider, and I know the geopolitics may tilt the other way on some of these regional conflicts, but do keep in mind that Ukraine, after the events in Maidan in 2013 and 14, and then after the conflict began, which continues in the Donbass, is not a member of the ICC and entered a declaration that initially gave the ICC jurisdiction to examine the crimes in Maidan in Kyiv, and then later expanded it to include everything that might have happened in Ukraine that could have been a war crime or a crime against humanity since, say, November, I think, of 2013. When a state does that, it sort of puts itself before the ICC. It doesn't say the ICC will prosecute. It could prosecute its soldiers. It could prosecute others. It could look at all sides. But unlike a situation where a country is a state party, then opening a case isn't automatic. If a state party says, "Please take our case," then the prosecutor can proceed even without going to the judges. In the case of Ukraine, she has to go to the judges, and hasn't done that yet, and it continues to evaluate and deal with the situation. Georgia, on the other hand, did refer itself to the ICC, but it's a state party, and so the ICC opened an investigation concerning the crime. I mean, I should correct this in a point. Georgia asked for the assistance of the ICC. I don't think it formally referred itself, but it encouraged the prosecutor to look at the situation, and eventually the prosecutor opened an investigation of the events surrounding the war in South Ossetia and the events of August 2008. But no indictments have yet resulted, and we know very little about what might occur there, though there could be prosecutions on both sides, could implicate Russian forces, even though Russia is not a state party. So it is possible for these things to come to the ICC, but it really requires states to send it forward. And then there's always the danger that the ICC could decide to come after their people. And so there's a general reluctance to do this unless the slate is such that it's unlikely that they face any vulnerabilities on the side of the referring state.
And with regards to state leaders, for example, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda was set up after Paul Kagame's victory in the Rwandan Civil War, and Charles Taylor had already lost control of the majority of Liberia when the Special Court for Sierra Leone was set up. You were involved in these tribunals. There are other examples like this: Omar al-Bashir in Sudan and Laurent Gbagbo in Côte d'Ivoire. Is there a trend in the world that these big war crimes trials with regards to state leaders only really take place once the regime has fallen or the government is out of power?
Well, do keep in mind the greatest precedent of all of this is Nuremberg, that started 75 years ago this month, and that was obviously the four victorious allies appointing judges to try the Nazis, of course, for horrendous crimes. But only after the Nazis were defeated. If there had been an arrest warrant for Hitler in 1944, one would not anticipate that he would have been brought into custody until the war was over. So usually the realpolitik of this is going to dictate. I would notice, on the other hand, that we see recently where President Thaci of Kosovo was indicted by a special court and surrendered and was arrested and resigned as president. Milosevic was in power. It was during the Kosovo operation, and when he was indicted, the following year he lost power in an election to a fellow nationalist, but one that hadn't supported the Milosevic policies, and was being prosecuted for corruption in Serbia when the ICC, or when the ICTY, the Yugoslavia Tribunal, brought him to justice. Taylor was in power in Liberia, you say facing an armed insurrection in his own country, when he was indicted by my predecessor at the Special Court for Sierra Leone. He eventually gave up power, went to Nigeria, allegedly broke the agreement under which he wouldn't interfere in the politics of the region, and the government of Liberia, when there was a new one elected, asked that he be sent to the Special Court for for Sierra Leone. And of course, we have with Omar al-Bashir, him being under an indictment that resulted from the Security Council sending the case of Darfur to the ICC, which took a vote of the Security Council. There was no, I think the Russians actually voted for that one. The U.S. abstained. There were 10 votes for it. And eventually, of course, he's been overthrown for other reasons, and there's a lot of indication that eventually he may end up in The Hague. So to some extent, when these international courts take these actions, and when they face a very powerful individual, they may not succeed immediately, but there is a momentum and a situation where eventually the people that are charged become pariahs, are recognized as not very helpful to their own country, and eventually they end up in The Hague if they remain alive. And so I think you don't want to overstate the impact of international justice, because it has no police powers. It has no ability to send people or troops out to make some arrests somewhere. But it does have this kind of force. But I think you point to the main attack on it, which is countries that have sort of high-level sponsorship or friendships among great powers, and certainly the leadership of those great powers tend to, it's a lot harder to get to, let's put it that way. And it's more likely that the people that will face justice are people that don't have allies in high places. I only say that reservedly because obviously there are a number of individuals that have been supported by great powers that have ended up in the dock and have been recognized as having really gone off the deep end in terms of their own sponsors and having done things that really undermined their side, so to speak. And so you can cross the line and end up in international justice, and it's out there, and it affects countries even that aren't under it. Israel's not under the ICC, but they're always worried about where they stand and what could happen. And so these things do impact countries, even if the way in which they might end up arrested, it can't really be seen at the moment.
And there is evidence that Azerbaijan used white phosphorus in this war against Armenia, but I was surprised to learn that there is evidence that the Assad regime has used white phosphorus, as the same goes for Turkey and Russia in Syria, as well as Israel in Gaza. Do you think that in terms of war crimes, there is a sort of chart or ranking wherein some are considered more heinous than others, and that might be why that there is little action in some regards?
Well, keep in mind, in the question of, there is a hierarchy in a way in terms of, I've been a former international prosecutor where one has to take a stand in terms of what are the most important and significant cases. And certainly it follows a sort of a common sense or our own sort of moral view of things, but and that's shared by I think all of humankind. But someone that's out intentionally killing men, women, and children, innocent people, engaged in a genocide, hacking people to death, the crimes that ISIS has committed, beheading old people, selling young girls into sexual slavery. These kinds of things are clearly intentional. They're approved sometimes by regimes and by forces that view this as a way to further their ends, and those kinds of crimes are going to be viewed as the most egregious. Of course, sometimes genocide is a hard thing to prove. You have to prove intent to destroy a whole people or a people in significant part. Doesn't apply to political groups. It applies only to ethnic or religious or national groups. But those kind of crimes are really the most serious, and the crimes against humanity that can occur even outside wartime, pogroms against certain groups, etc., political vendettas against ethnic groups that are opposed to the party in power, etc. Those kinds of things are more likely to land someone in the dock. Particularly things that relate to the conduct of combat operations are very hard to prove. People have mixed feelings, I know, in the region about the Yugoslavia tribunal, but it never really succeeded except in the constant bombardment of the civilians in Sarajevo in convicting people of things relating to conduct of operations. There was the case against General Gotovina, the Croatian general, there was evidence that the Croatian forces in Operation Storm had targeted Serbian neighborhoods in order to drive Serbs that had lived for hundreds of years in the Krajina back toward Serbia. And in the end, by a 3-2 vote, he was acquitted because there were no maps showing what he'd been shooting at. The fact that shells had landed, one of the judges had ruled that, well, if shells land more than 200 meters away from a military target, there must be a war crime intended. The judges say there's no 200 meter standard. So in the absence of sort of inside proof of what was being done, it's very hard to prove those cases. And of course, within combat, there's collateral damage, there's all sorts of things. And the laws of war allow for the fact that civilians will be killed. But, have these rules of proportionality, et cetera. And it becomes very hard to turn that into a criminal situation. When it comes to weapons, there are weapons that have dual uses. I mean, phosphorus can be a way to illuminate the battlefield, but you don't use it to burn human flesh, et cetera. So the question is, well, how are they using it? There are some new conventions that say certain weapons are always banned, but those haven't been accepted completely. Chemical weapons, for instance, are always banned. If you're talking about chemicals that are only used for killing, such as sarin gas, but chlorine, for instance, of course, is a dual-use chemical. You use it all the time for cleaning, et cetera. So it's not banned. But of course, using it in combat becomes a war crime because it's not something that can be targeted to soldiers exclusively, and it seems to be used in order to get to civilians that may be hiding underground because it's heavier than air. And so you have to evaluate these things, and within combat, it is extremely difficult to make a criminal case of war crimes. And so when we do prosecutions, even at the national level, they tend to be of situations of individual soldiers who run amok and started killing civilians and things like that. And it's important that those cases be done and that countries do them themselves because it sends a signal to others to conduct their operations properly. Even in a lethal situation. So it's a challenging area to deal with, and of course for those that are victimized, for those that are murdered, let's not say murdered, but those that are killed. And if your child is killed in a combat area, not fighting or anything else, one naturally is going to be outraged by that. But if it's in the middle of combat, it can be very hard to show that that was a war crime and not the damage that resulted from targeting with the kind of weapons that are permitted.
And finally, I want to ask you, in 2020, we're seeing the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar, the civil wars in Syria and Yemen. Do you think that anything additional is needed in the international arena to deal with war crimes which are still taking place around the world?
Well, I mean, I think... And keep in mind, we talk about all these things as war crimes, but it's probably more appropriate to think of them as atrocity crimes, and those are crimes in which the innocents are targeted, or operations are conducted in a way that innocents will die with no rhyme or reason in terms of what the military advantage was, and so. Those are things where I think we do need more enforcement, and obviously the International Criminal Court is limited in its effect, hasn't been enormously successful in some of its more challenging cases. I'm a strong believer that we are having these days, and we see some of this in the conflict in Karabakh, more documentation of the crimes, more use of cell phone apps like Eyewitness that take images, immediately record it and send it, and monitor the metadata to make sure that there's no fakes, there's no photoshopping, etc. A lot is being done. Of course, we don't want people putting themselves in danger, but in this documentation area, where in Syria we now have bigger files in terms of what was happening than we had from Nazi Germany. So that is really important, and doing that in a quality way, and then having that information available for enforcement, and finding ways in which this can be used in courts that countries will accept is, I think, the real challenge. Just to say, before we conclude, I mean, I've been to Shushi, was there last year, went to Stepanakert and saw what was the positive things that were happening in that region. Went to the great monastery at Databank, very concerned when I saw the prospects, the threats of ethnic cleansing, and one of the horrors that could happen in a conflict like this, and happened in others, where there's a strong desire to push people out. You get this sort of a targeted attacking of civilians in order to make their life intolerable. And that's some of the worst kind of things that we have in these situations where people of different ethnicities and religions have been living together, sometimes peacefully for a long period of time, but yet there's a record of grievance at a political level. And so this is something that we really have to avoid. And I know this peace agreement is very unpopular, and I can understand that, knowing what's happened in Armenia and the region in the past. But I hope that we can proceed in a way that protects people from ethnic cleansing and protects civilians, and if there really is going to be peace, then I think justice has to be a part of it, and there has to be an understanding that where one side or another has committed violations, people responsible for those violations should be held to account, and that is a positive thing for everybody if done in a fair way. But it would require courts that were balanced, that wouldn't look like they were political. And when things happen, there would naturally be criticism of that. But I do think that peace will take justice, and the dangers, obviously, in this conflict is the conflict could flare up again, and then this time it could be worse and worse and worse and worse. And in so many of these situations, everyone has been the loser at the end of the day. So I hope that justice is considered here, and that people talk about ways in which those who have violated the law can be held to account, because I think it would serve everyone's interest.
Well, Ambassador, thank you very much for your time.
Yes, enjoyed the conversation. Take care.
And thank you for joining us on CivilNet.